Welcome to Unmasking Social, where we talk about building real friendships and meaningful connections without masking who we truly are. I'm your host, Sharon Baum, a speech and language pathologist with an expertise in social thinking and how it relates to autism and ADHD, specifically with our teens and tweens. Let's dive in. Sensory. Sensory has become a word that a lot of people use but really don't understand. How can we get our neurodivergent teens, tweens, young adults, and children to be regulated in a world that's so dysregulating? On today's podcast, we have the Sensory SLP, who many of you know as Jessie Ginsburg, to break down strategies and supports so that our individuals who we work with, who we love, can actually stay regulated despite dysregulation. All right, everybody, welcome back to Unmasking Social. Today, I have the Sensory SLP on. I've been following the Sensory SLP, by the way, she has a name, Jessie Ginsburg's work for quite a while, because she is a neuroaffirming speech and language pathologist who also focuses a lot on that sensory regulation piece. I actually knew Jessie, if you don't mind me sharing this, before I even knew Jessie, because I knew her partner, Chris, who shares really great stuff as the speech dude for middle school and high school students, especially those teens and tweens, and also practices in a very neuroaffirming way. So before I was able to fangirl her, I was fangirling him in my practices. So Jessie, I'll turn it over to you just so you can give a synopsis of where you're at now and kind of what led you to this journey in terms of really honing in on a piece that is so critical but often overlooked, the sensory piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me. And that was impressive. You knew Chris's name too. See, a lot of people, we were just talking about how we just got back from ASHA, but a lot of people just walk by and they're like, speech dude. And then he's like, hey, what's up? You know, he's loud.
Yeah. He's more than
So,
the speech dude. Much more
yeah,
than, yeah.
yeah, exactly. But yes, I'm an SLP. I own a private practice here in Los Angeles. We just celebrated 12 years, which is where I am here. In our clinic, we see about 200 kids a week. And then I do a lot of online education and training, mainly for other therapists, a lot for families as well, but I would say mainly for therapists who want to learn more about incorporating sensory into their work as SLPs. Because to me, once I found sensory, it just felt like it was a missing piece. And I think a lot of therapists have a similar experience to that.
Yeah. And I know that you're also very big on giving webinars and everything on this piece. And on there, you stress obviously the sensory struggle, which sometimes it seems just in my practices with adolescents as a speech pathologist too. I love having these SLP episodes together. I always found that these behavioral disruptions, so to say, or a child's acting out was very often or more often than not rooted in a sensory dysregulation. Correct me if I'm wrong. And they were responding to the overstimulation or understimulation or whatever was going on with their senses, and then started acting out in ways that people or teachers or whoever else working with them viewed as behavioral disruption. So would you be able to speak to just kind of how you were able to work through those sensory pieces? And like, are you able to distinguish, like, how do we distinguish between what's a behavior or what's a response to a sensory
Yeah.
struggle?
You know, one of the coolest things about learning sensory strategies is that they work and they work almost instantly. And you could think of something that you do for yourself where your mood changes immediately just because of one small thing that you did. And that's why you'll have someone who, like, I don't know, tells you to take a few deep breaths and then you notice the change in yourself. Or if you're feeling anxious, like antsy, and you got to get up and move, and then you go take a walk around the block and come back to your desk, you're going to feel instantly, you're going to feel better. So I think one of the greatest things about sensory strategies is that they work, and they work so quickly that you are able to, you know, that phrase, I don't know who says it, but it's like success leaves clues. And it's kind of like that same concept where regulation leaves clues. We get to actually see a child change in real time. So at least we know that if we try something, that we're going to either see that it works or we're going to see that it doesn't work pretty quickly. So that's the benefit. But yeah, I mean, there's so much that affects kids and their ability to be regulated, and so often just pointed, you know, people just point at behaviors and say, look at this kid, look how disruptive they are. Why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? Without looking at any of the underlying reasons why those things might be happening. We just had a family drive to our clinic from, it should have been like maybe a 2-3 hour drive. I think it took them like 4+ hours to drive to us. And I said to the mom, I would really recommend trying to go somewhere closer. This isn't realistic. Like, I know you want to see us. We could see you
Right.
virtually, but that's such a far drive. And she said, no, I have to see you guys because I've tried everything else and I have to come. Like, this is going to be worth it for me to come. And so she came in with her son. He's autistic, late elementary school. And they're just having all these, quote, problems and quote behaviors in class, like trying to run out of class, aggression, biting people. And then you look at, well, how are they addressing these quote behaviors? Is they're having him, they put a timer on his desk and he has to put his head down. And then if he tries to get up, they restart the time.
Mm.
And instead of going out to recess, they're holding him back in the classroom because he's having to prove that, he has to sit through this, punishment of not doing whatever it was that he was supposed to be doing. And it was just, we went through his IEP. Me and Chris actually did this together, looked through his IEP together. And we were it's just all behavioral strategies being used in there. I mean, none of his emotional needs were being met. None of his sensory needs were being met. They weren't working on his total communication, weren't really using his AAC that they were supposed to be using in the classroom. So you take a kid like that and you look and you see these behaviors, you see the running, the biting, the aggression, all of that. And not that it's just coming from nowhere. He's in an environment where doesn't have one single safe person emotionally. So his emotional needs aren't being met, his sensory needs aren't being met, his communication needs aren't being met. But it's sad because so many kids are in classrooms like this and the teachers just don't know what to do. And they genuinely don't realize that all of these needs are not being met. So a lot of education still needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I find that so heartbreaking that somebody has to put their head down because of a behavior. I just feel like in the world we live in now, we do have a lot of education at our disposal, and the putting of the head down, and then having a timer, and then you can get up, and then you can move around. It seems like something so antiquated in my mind because after I went to grad school, I had limited knowledge of the social world as per this neuroaffirming way. Because in grad school, when I went, and I don't know if when you experience the same things, but we were taught like it in a very prescriptive manner where it was more, okay, do this, and what's your like, and then you ask them a question. Okay, so how are you going to react in this situation? It's kind of very much teaching as opposed to observing and noticing with them. And so things for me changed when I was able to be part of this collaborative program that was very much part of this neuroaffirming, meeting the child where they are, meeting the teen and tween where they are, trying to figure out with them, really getting to learn about them and their strengths, but then working collaboratively on what they're going to achieve, as opposed to telling them, okay, you did something bad, and therefore this is going to be your punishment. Of course, punishments are going to occur in certain scenarios, but now when you're teaching social, when did you, because my realization happened because of, again, the luck that I had to be in the program. Otherwise, I would not have known, when did your realization occur where you realized, wow, like, okay, wait, something is really off here? Or did you always know that when it came to these individuals, the neurodivergent folks and their sensory needs?
Yeah, so I actually tell this story in my book. It's the very first chapter about when I was an SLP assistant. I had this little boy who was autistic. He was 3, non-speaking, and I saw him for floor time therapy. So I was hired as an SLP assistant. I was also a floor time therapist and a social skills therapist. So I had 3-hour sessions with him every Monday at 9 a.m. Okay, 2 hours. 2 hours and 45 minutes, right? 15 minutes indirect time. And I just had no idea how to get him engaged. And every week and this was my first job in the field. And every week it was coming in thinking, like, what is wrong with me? Am I a horrible therapist? I can't get anything out of him. I would try a bunch of things, couldn't find what he liked. The only thing he liked was cars. And if he played with cars, he laid on the ground. It was so hard for me to get him engaged with them. And then my supervisor came to me and said, and it was a pretty big clinic. There were probably like 20 supervisors. So my supervisor came to me and said, "Hey, we want you to record this boy for our next supervisors meeting so that we can watch it and give you feedback." And went into fight or flight.
Yeah.
I guess freeze is what I went into, shut down. Should have gone into flight maybe. But I just completely shut down. I was like, "Oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing with this kid. How am I possibly going to show them that I know what I'm doing and that I'm a good therapist worthy of being here?" And so it kind of caused me to just really think outside of the box. I set up the camera to record, it was like the clinic handheld camera, and I start putting on music, and he gets up on my little kid's table and he starts dancing, and I start dancing behind him, and I look like a fool, and I can say that because I have it on video.
Roll the tapes.
Yeah. And then, he turned around and looked at me, and then I said, "Ready, set," and he looked and he said, "Go," and it was the first word I heard from him, and I picked him up, and he jumped off the table into my arms, and the weight of him jumping off made me fall backward, and we both, rolled backward laughing, and then he ran around to the side of the table, and he got back up, and we just did that over and over again, and I was so excited to show that tape to my supervisors because this was like one of those kids who everyone knows in the clinic. He's the kid who's running
Yeah.
in and out of everyone's rooms. And then my supervisor, the first thing she said was, "Why'd you let him stand on the table?" I was
Mm.
like, "Oh, okay." Anyway, that led me to the realization that, therapy sometimes needs to be out of the box. We need to
Mhm.
put aside the things that we're taught. We need to make the focus about connection. And when we can do that is when we see our kids really grow and develop. So that was kind of like the very first seed planted, which then led to me doing more co-treats with the OTs and the practice, and then eventually learning more about sensory. And I had that same experience with so many of my kids. It was like I'd have kids come in who I just felt like almost were stuck in their language and I just wasn't getting that much out of them. And then I would take them into the gym, put them on the swing, and their eyes would light up. Like I could picture some of these kids, even though they're well over 10 years ago, I could picture these moments still because that's how powerful it was at the time to be able to see that shift in their regulation. So I did start getting a lot of sensory training pretty early on in my career, so it has been a pretty foundational piece of everything I've done so far.
Wow. So all it took was a supervisor trying to check in on you, and then you playing the music, and then suddenly here, voila, you had an amazing session of the shared experience, the shared connection. And you said this was the first word that the child had ever uttered, and that the proof is in the pudding. Something was energizing him, which was
Mhm.
something of interest, which is a big thing I think that people shy away from still, like you had stated. How do we regulate these kids? How do we focus on the strengths and interests and things like that? And then as SLPs trained in it, we can understand a little bit more about it. And I think that's in your book, Ready, Set, Connect, right?
Uh-huh.
For those who
Yeah.
haven't read it, Ready, Set, Connect. It's all about connection through this lens, through this model. But you mentioned something interesting in there, which is, first of all, you were using an out of the box approach, which is needed all the time because if, as Stephen Shore says, Dr. Stephen Shore, and he was on the podcast, if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism, right? It's all going to look different and it's going to manifest differently and it has to be tailored to the child. Like you said, the gym versus the music versus whatever you may be doing to elicit this connection. And then it's interesting because you mentioned the OT, you started collaborating with the OT, right? And I always find this struggle, which is people always say, who's supposed to be working on the sensory regulation piece, right? Is it the SLP? Is the OT the expert? Is the teacher who has a certification in special education the expert in it? And I feel like sometimes it becomes almost like a battle. I don't know if you feel that too, where people start saying, well, you're a speech pathologist, like what is your role in the sensory piece? So I know that we have a big role. I understand that, but for those listening, how crucial is it for us to be involved in that sensory piece while
It is
acknowledging that others can?
100,000% crucial. And what you're explaining is it's like story of my life.
Mhm.
Because when I started talking about sensory and it was just like huge waves on the internet, like who is this SLP trying to take sensory away from us? And so what I did is I went through every sensory training I could possibly find, and then I just started going directly to the source. So I created my sensory course. I went to Dr. Winnie Dunn, and if therapists are on here, they would know her. She created the sensory profile, very, very well known OT, arguably one of the most well known OTs out there, especially in the sensory space. And she came into my course and she did a guest lecture, and I consulted with her as I was writing it. And then I wanted to write for ASHA, which is the National Magazine for Speech Therapists, for anyone who's not aware of that. And I went to her and she wrote an article with me. And I'm like, we got to get more people on board here. So it's just that for so long, speech therapists learn you're a speech therapist. You work on speech and language, and that's what you work on. While Chris and I were at ASHA presenting, there were two other talks on sensory at the exact same time that we were speaking.
Oh, wow. Oh, gosh.
Like 5 years ago, that would have never happened because that was not a topic area that was coming to our conferences. That was not part of what we were learning as SLPs. So that has really changed a lot. But I've talked to Winnie Dunn about this extensively, just the idea that everyone has a seat at the sensory table, because if a child needs speech therapy and has sensory differences, and their sensory differences are impacting their language, then their sensory differences are probably impacting everything else in their life. It's probably impacting all of their, daily living skills, all of their like potty training, eating, being in the classroom, being at home. It's not that sensory doesn't just affect one part of your life, So that's kind of where I've been able to come to other, not just SLPs, but lots of types of professionals and say, what we're doing in sensory is not the same as what you're doing because your goals are different than our goals. And for me, sensory is the approach we're using to meet the goal. And our goal is still communication. Our goal is still building language. And sometimes therapists will say, okay, so now that you have sensory training, how do you change your goals? And the answer is my goals are still the same. My goals are still,
Yes.
if they're not neuroaffirming goals, maybe I would change them, but my goals are still the same. It's just that my approach I'm using to meet those goals are different. And I think once we say that and explain that, then it makes sense to everyone. Just like you would never not want a teacher to know sensory strategies so that their kid could do better in class. You would never want a parent not to know sensory strategies so that they could help their kid at home. And you would never want to withhold sensory strategies from that person, from the individual with the sensory differences, So we all have our own unique needs and ways to be using regulation strategies.
Yeah, I think that was so well said the way you just explained that because everybody has a seat at the sensory table because being dysregulated impacts everything in one's life. Just think about being dysregulated, even if you're neurotypical, that impacts your relationships with other people. It interrupts communication with whoever it may be. And then we're thinking about school environments, we're thinking about transitions, we're thinking about being in class, but then moving to another task. And then if you're just regulated the entire time, how exactly are you going to achieve any of the goals that are on that individualized education plan or even beyond that? How are you going to achieve, like you said, the daily life activities when sensory is so foundational, it seems like to everything that anybody does involves some sort of internal regulation. So it's great that you've collaborated and with so many people because again, the reason why I brought this up is because I also run into this sometimes too, which is wait, is that an OT thing? Is that a speech thing? People get very confused in terms of who's supposed to directly work on it. But the truth is, I feel like everybody needs to work on it, like you were saying.
Mhm.
And even if it's in indirect way, like you said, to accomplish the goal, like that's important. So that kind of brings me to my next point, which is you're so knowledgeable about this topic because, like you said, you took every webinar under the sun, you collaborated with Winnie Dunn, you now are teaching so many people about the sensory piece. And uh, a lot of times people wonder okay, well, if somebody's in the middle of a fight or flight moment and they're in a crisis mode, very hard to get them regulated because they are really just trying to figure out how to calm down or become regulated. And then there are other situations where someone's about to kind of be on the brink, right? Because as neuroaffirming therapists, we should know the triggers that alarm our students. So we kind of know that they're kind of on the brink of one. Are there any specific strategies that you've utilized or that you teach about others about utilizing to get the child regulated when they're not in that crisis moment, but you could see that it could be potentially heading in that direction?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the biggest difference you could possibly make is just by knowing and understanding and controlling your own regulation.
Yeah.
Because the energy that we put out directly affects those around us. And I don't think I mentioned this yet, but I have 5 kids. I have 5 boys, 9 and under. So I bring that up to say our whole life could be dysregulated.
Yeah, I mean,
If we had
totally
no
imagine.
awareness of our own regulation, our parenting would be even more of a circus than it already is.
Mhm.
And one of the greatest gifts you could give to a child is a regulated adult because a dysregulated adult cannot regulate a dysregulated child. So, what happens is we see our kids starting to maybe, like, I like to think of sensory like a seesaw. So, maybe we start to see their seesaw starting to tip, like, oh, they're starting to move toward a state of dysregulation. And then we freak out because we either know what's coming or we're afraid of what's coming or we have anxiety or trauma about the last time this happened. And then
Mhm.
all of a sudden, our seesaw's tipped and we're the dysregulated ones. And how are we going to get this kid back to center if we're not back to center? So I think one of the great things about learning more about sensory and having that training, and this is something that I've seen because I've trained so many therapists in my clinic, is that once you have that knowledge and training, your confidence changes so much so that when you do have a kid come in dysregulated or start to get dysregulated, it doesn't shake you as much because you know that it's not your fault, first of all. Like, you're not the problem. It's the environment. Maybe we need a better strategy. Maybe they had a hard day. Like, we're taking the blame off of, oh, I'm just not a good enough therapist, first of all.
Mhm.
And that helps. And then just knowing that there are things that you can do to have an immediate impact, I think help your confidence so much that it really helps you to remain more stable and regulated yourself, which helps so much. And gosh, there are just so many moments when, I've had kids who come in and they're dysregulated and then I'm dysregulated and then we're both dysregulated together and then the session's over and I'm like, what just happened? So
I
being
relate to that.
able to know that this child's regulation is directly affected by your regulation, um, maybe easier said than done sometimes. Yeah, if you want to talk about some like tactical strategies, we could talk about those too.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great, but just something resonated with me. I mean, a lot resonated with me, but specifically just about making sure that you're calm, that your nervous system is in check. Because I found in certain experiences that I also get rattled. And then once I'm rattled, especially I've seen specifically with the autistic teens and tweens that I've worked with versus the ones that are not neurodivergent at all, I find that they can sense it so easily. They could smell everything from a mile away. They're so observant that, like, anything that's different, they will notice immediately. Like, it is just kind of like a moment of, okay, even if I change something really simple, like something on my nails or something, they'll notice it immediately. So if my calm is not there, they've always been very cognizant of that. So I think that's such an important point because I think a lot of us, it's not automatically, when you're in that moment and somebody's heading towards that crisis and it's getting worse and you have a whole group, you're right. There is an automatic kind of nervousness that comes in, but it seems like you have a lot of practice because on your Instagram videos, when you're with your 5 kids, you and Chris are just kind of walking around the kitchen and hanging out, and it looks like you guys are pretty calm, and it looks like the boys are really calm too, the 5 boys. So
Any
yeah, so
given day, you never know what you're gonna get.
you don't know, but it seems like you're maintaining, like, you're able to just kinda do these. It's not so easy even on social media to post with 5 boys, and everybody's just kind of following each other in sync, and just having this calmness, but perhaps you're presenting, like you said, that calmness to them, and they're kind of following suit. But, yeah, I mean, are there any, specific strategies or, like, a strategy that's your favorite that you've taught that other people have really, welcomed in? Because I know it's really hard to teach this to people and have them really apply it in their day-to-day routines because it's really like shifting the mindset a little bit about how to address these what we think are behaviors but really regulation challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that when I have a kid who comes in for a session, the first thing that I do is I call a temperature check. It's just like, where is this child's regulation right now? Then usually I ask myself about my own regulation. And
Mhm.
then I can kind of figure out where that starting point is for them. And I like to talk about, that our goal in our speech sessions is a child in that optimal level of alertness. And we have kids who might come in kind of, I like to say, like our Eeyores, like very low energy, very passive. And these are kids where we might see them and then we might take a breath, like, I'm just going to chill with my chill client right now. He's so easygoing right now. But the truth is that he's actually really understimulated and needs a little bit more.
Mhm.
So those are for the
Right.
kids who kind of come in and just seem like they're not that excited to be there. You're like, wait,
Mhm.
this is fun. What's happening here? And they just kind of are coming off like a little bit more passive. And then we have our kids who are our Tiggers who come in with an abundance of energy. And those are the kids I think that really cause us to get dysregulated quickly because we see that and then we tend to become that as well. So, energy is contagious. So, one of the best things that we can do is we can be the kind of energy that we want that child to be. And it's very counterintuitive because when you have a kid come in, I had this little girl I used to see who would come in and she was 3 and our doors are heavy. I don't know. Like she'd come in with her superhuman strength and like
Wow.
open the doors, not wait in the waiting room, not check in, and she'd just go in all the rooms, she'd climb my stuff, she'd pull the toys down, she'd dump, and it was just like one of those kids, like we've all had them, that are just constantly
Mhm.
on the move, and when she would come in, I would say, like, "I need to out-fun her. I need to be more fun than her because if
Mhm.
not more fun than her, then how am I gonna get her attention?" So I would just, like, be out of my mind trying to figure out how can I be bigger and louder and more energetic and bring the fun, and all that would do is further dysregulate her because it's my energy feeding off her energy, feeding off mine, and it would just be like up, 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 and then dysregulated 2 people at the end of the session. And for her, when I started, realizing that I needed to do the opposite because when I first started learning about sensory, in your mind, you kind of think like sensory equals big movement.
Mhm.
I didn't realize that, there's so much more to it than that. And for this little girl, she was already Tigger. I needed to bring her down. Need to calm her down a little bit. So having that temperature check where a student comes in, you're like, where are they? Are they an Eeyore today? Are they a Tigger today? Are they somewhere in between where we want them to be? And if they're a Tigger, how can we just start the session by doing something that's going to be calming? And I know I work with a lot of little ones. You work with teens and tweens, but with the little ones, starting with a hello song and just giving them the type of input that they need at the beginning of the session is really, really helpful. Whereas for older kids, we have things like, here on my ground, one of my kids' favorite things is we have a vibration plate. And they're so much fun, so alerting for our kids that just need like a little bit of something when they come in. We have tons of like, I'm literally holding one right now, my favorite
For those who
fidget.
aren't watching, it looks like a really fun, almost like an ice cube that melted, but
Yeah,
that you can
jelly
squeeze.
kind of.
Yeah,
Because
I
like
could
I
benefit
have
from that.
trouble sitting still sometimes for an hour like this.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Oh, same.
just
Yeah.
offering the opportunity from the very beginning of the session and just normalizing it. So when we have a group, I have a bag. We have tons of different bags of fidgets and stuff like that. So when we have a group, I have one right after this. We bring in a bag of one of our fidgets, we just pass it around, and I take one and then I pass it around. So it's just like, let's all enjoy, like, who doesn't love sitting here if we're going to sit here and hold a fidget? So
Yeah.
starting the session with regulation in mind.
Yeah, and then they get older, just to make a joke here, and then they start throwing the fidgets. That's when it gets really fun, and then we have to regulate that because the fidgets end up in my face and whatever it may be, just because, they're fun. If they're especially if they're little ballies like that, it's
Mhm.
fun to just, practice, some basketball moves. But I really like the Eeyore, how you use that metaphor, that Eeyore metaphor, because you made me reflect right now. I know that this isn't, one of your interactive webinar sessions or anything like that, but you made me reflect on a moment I had today even, actually, with a group that was very dysregulated, and there was an Eeyore in the group. And I was so distracted by the Tiggers, as you call them, right? The Tiggers that were so overstimulated that I became a little bit more overstimulated, and I had my attention on Eeyore, but Eeyore was just really just kind of there, and you I really had to check in with myself, and now I'm checking in actually even more. I'm having a aha moment as we speak based on what you said. I had to check in and say, wait, he's really calm, but he's really calm because he's so passive that he's just sitting there taking it all in, not really responding to anything. He's not showing any responses to anything that's going on, but he is staying on task. So that felt like a half a win. But then there was a piece, and I spoke to the OT about this because he saw it too, where I said, but wait, he needs to start responding to some of these things, even if it's just advocating, speaking up. So that would be the Eeyore, the one that's underwhelmed, that's understimulated, right? But I guess a panacea to that would be to just start, like you said, in the beginning of the session, knowing, right? Once you know where the individual is on the spectrum of Eeyore and Tiggers or somewhere in between, you could already know to have that what you refer to as like almost like those grounding activities, which may look a little different between the children and teens and tweens, but not very different, because the grounding activities always require a check-in with feelings, a check-in with what kind of objects that can stimulate. But that kind of I think that those kids are overlooked a lot, in my
For
opinion. I don't know
sure.
if you feel the same way, the ones that are just going with the flow in the group, because I feel like they are usually the ones that are kind of giving you what you want, which is calm.
Yeah, I mean, they're not the
Have you
quote
seen that too?
problem kids, they're not the ones that are getting picked out by teachers and saying this kid is a problem.
Yeah.
So I love having those aha moments with kids like that because you will see that if you take a kid like that and you start and give them something that's gonna be more alerting at the beginning of the session, like, you will see a difference in that kid, and that's one of the coolest things to see is a kid where you're like, "Oh, I thought he was just kind of like, meh, not that interested, and just kinda there," and you see a kid like that shift into even communicating even more, which is really cool to see. But, yeah, groups is a huge, huge question that we get because people say, "How do you know, do it when they all have different needs in the group?" And like, I don't have a preference if everyone has the same needs or different needs because it could be a hard group if everyone's a Tigger,
Yes.
right?
Oh,
So,
yeah.
like, maybe there's a little bit of beauty in the fact that a lot of times our kids need different things in groups. And what we'll do in our groups is we just tailor those specific activities based on what a kid needs. And again, different age group here, but like, maybe we'll put out a pop-up tunnel, and for our Eeyore, we're gonna say, "Okay, I want you to go through the tunnel as fast as you can. Okay, ready?
Mhm.
Go." And then the next kid, it's like, "Okay, I wanna give you this." I'm like a weighted stuffed animal. "I wanna give you this bear, and I want you to pull this bear through the tunnel." So it's like we're still doing the same activity, but we're gonna
Yeah.
do it in different
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah, just energetic movement, trying to get that energy flowing, trying to get the individual to speak up a little bit more and feel a little bit more passionate. I mean, the personality will still be the same. This is a more passive kid, it sounds like, right? In your case and in my case, some kids are just more passive, and that's okay. We're not trying to change the personality, it sounds like. We're just trying to change the response so that they can be a little bit more regulated,
Yeah,
essentially,
it's
and
just their
underregulated.
alertness level, because we all have these different levels of alertness we go through throughout the day. So, like, we wake up, we're groggy, we're tired, we're Eeyore when we
Yeah.
wake up. But
Oh, yeah, I'm
for
not a
most of
morning person.
us,
I'm an Eeyore in the morning, yeah, before coffee.
yeah, you're like, okay, 3 cups of coffee, and now I'm in this optimal area. I'm
Then I'm
good.
a chicken, yeah,
And
mhm,
then something stressful happens at work, and then you jump up into this high
yeah,
arousal Tigger zone, and then you know how to self-regulate, though, and a lot of adults know some. We're still learning. We know how to self-regulate enough where we can control our level of alertness, and we can bring ourselves down so that we can finish our day and more optimal, turn the TV on, go sink back into Eeyore. But for a lot of our neurodivergent kids, they just tend to quote like live in these other areas as more of a baseline. So they might just have a higher level of energy as a baseline or a lower level of energy as a baseline. And because they have sensory differences and because many kids don't know their sensory needs, because why would they? We barely know our own.
exactly.
They have trouble knowing how to change their state of regulation throughout the day. So,
Yeah,
it's interesting because the more you learn about yourself, the more you're able to help your kids. And we had a training, I remember back maybe last year, and it was a few hundred people. And a therapist came up and said, I have a 5-year-old client, but he doesn't know what his sensory needs are. So I don't know how to help him.
Oh,
And I remember standing there thinking about it and thinking, well, half the people in this room probably don't know what their sensory needs are. Like, why would a
right.
5-year-old know? They have to explicitly learn and be taught and have those conversations. So
Even
for
as
her,
an adult, right? I feel like
yeah,
I'm still learning, like, each day I feel like I need something different to
yeah.
regulate. Yeah.
So it's these conversations need to be had from kids from a very young age, and in align with what your whole purpose of this podcast and the message that you're trying to share is that being able to do what feels good and what is authentic to you and not feel like you have to mask to hide all of those needs that you have. Instead, we talk about them and we learn about them so that we can give ourselves the support, the accommodations that we need.
Yeah, I mean, right, because the title is Unmasking Social, so in that vein, you bring up a good point where you're allowing everybody to be their true selves in their dysregulated states, but also supporting them so that they can feel comfortable unmasking, but feel calm doing it, as opposed to taking the mask off and being who they truly are, but then feeling really dysregulated internally because the two just don't fit together, it sounds like, because a dysregulated individual is going to have a hard time showing up as truly who they are. It's a lot of anxiety, it's a lot of just inner turmoil inside the body, it sounds like to me. But you also raised a really nice point about how that obviously a lot of individuals don't know their sensory needs, but you learn them quickly about the individuals. You can kind of feel what they need when they're younger, and then they start using those things. Like, are they able to generalize those things when they're at home and then also like in other settings? I mean, it takes a village, so everybody has to, work together, but are they able to then start identifying as they get older that, hey, this is what I really need?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that takes time. It's definitely something that kids have to learn that like we're all different. And once they can like get those accommodations in their IEPs and we get the right goals written for them where they are able to make their requests for those accommodations, they start to kind of learn. But, I think about my own kids and how different their sensory needs are. And, one of my kids is really anxious, falls into like the avoider category of his sensory
Yes.
profile. So really sensitive, notices things, but a lot of anxiety. And like, why is it so hard for him to go to school on the first day, but his brother can just roll up and have no concern whatsoever? So I love talking to my kids about all of their differences. And instead of painting it as like a deficit, you're teaching them to better understand themselves. It's funny, actually, because the analogy from the whole brain child, where they talk about the downstairs brain, the upstairs brain, and when we're dysregulated, it's like we're stuck in our downstairs brain. It's like a baby gate shuts, and we can't get upstairs to where all of our thinking happens and planning and all of that.
Right.
And there was a moment in my house, which you can imagine there are lots of
I'm sure there
dysregulating
are many
moments.
moments. Yeah.
There was a moment where one of my kids was so upset drawing, and he was just took this huge pile of construction paper and just threw it on the ground and ran back into his room and was so upset. And then I went to his room, comforted him, and then I came back after he had calmed down and I turned on my phone and I recorded having this conversation with him about the brain. And I explained the analogy, and like my 3 of my kids, I think, are sitting around me at the table, and I'm just drawing it for them, and I'm asking them questions about, like, in that moment, where do you think you were? Do you think you were thinking and planning, or was your body just taking over and just your body was like, "I have to throw that paper right now." And that video actually went viral, which was funny, but it's just like, I think because it's interesting to see us be able to have those conversations with kids and then be able to learn those skills from such a young age. So I
And
think
also
teaching
it's
kids
not.
analogies and things that like are kid friendly helps a lot.
Yeah, I mean, even the analogies you were using spoke to me as an adult, which we don't always use with ourselves, but then
Mhm.
you're bringing it to the kids, and I can only imagine you and Chris, you have kids that are probably always speaking about how they're feeling and what's going on in their body. Like I could just imagine it's like one big sensory fun household where everybody's activated and checking it. I'm sure a lot of the time they're not, but I could just visualize like a sensory household, sensory friendly household. And but you're actually using all these strategies with your own children at home, which is phenomenal. And I see them on social media. You're an amazing content creator with these like videos that obviously are going viral for a reason because people are relating to those moments in time that are really hard. But it sounds like you're also providing your children with some level of psychoeducation, which I think is missing a lot, like where we don't really explain the brain. We were never taught as SLPs that we should sit down and explain the brain to anybody because that was, not our domain. And that's the neuropsychologist domain or the psychologist domain. But do you find that breaking down parts of the brain and using these explanations of how the brain might be working in that moment can be really important and useful for us as SLPs when we're speaking about regulation?
Absolutely. I mean, you can't explain what you don't understand. And funny enough, like I sat down to write my book many times and I stopped many times because I was like, this is boring. Because I felt like I had to write it like I was writing a textbook or something. And when I just sat down and like kind of got into a free flow state and started writing, that's when the book was written so quickly. But it was all friendly, easy to understand analogies where we're talking about these things. Like, talk to me about a seesaw tipping, and I'm going to understand what you're talking about, you
Yeah.
know? So I think that, like, over time as SLPs, we start to have these conversations over and over again that you start to have things that you say to parents, and you're like, oh man, I could say that in my sleep. Like, I say that a lot. And just thinking about what are the things that you're saying over and over to parents and what are ways that we could put it into analogy, make it easier to understand. And then the exact same analogy is like a seesaw is something that an adult could understand. It's also something that a 5-year-old child could understand.
Yeah, and how can we tell somebody that they are going to be more regulated if they don't understand where the dysregulation is coming from or what is going on? And even with teens and tweens, they need metaphors too because it's very hard to really explain the brain and the procedures of the brain and the different parts of the brain. I'm not going to start talking with my teens and tweens necessarily unless that's their passion, if they really are passionate about the brain and studying neuroscience, but I won't necessarily start talking about the amygdala or the frontal lobe or things like that, right? So in that sense, you're taking something, I guess, that's conceptually really difficult and breaking it down to the individual, that can really so that they can grasp this.
Yeah.
And so you sat down, you wrote this book. This book was purchased by many people, and then you go into the webinar productions, which is really podcasts, but it's podcasts based on your webinars. They're like micro sessions, right? Based on you and Chris giving neuroaffirming strategies. But then you're also on social media and you have a page that many people follow. I believe the count is about 400,000 people, um, or something around that. But so people are listening to you, which is amazing. People are listening to the sensory piece. It's no longer something like you said in Asha's past where people would just show up and there wasn't even one course on sensory regulation. So things are changing. So what really motivated and inspired you to be the social media presence and just really get through like to so many people inside and outside of the classroom, and really try to get all these messages across in these amazing creative clips too?
Thank you. I think that I just had, had been working in my clinic for many years, and I just had a moment where I just felt like that more could have a greater impact on more people if I could just get in front of more people. And like working, I'd been working one to one for so long, but what if I could be working one to many? And, there's so many there. And then that came with the training of therapists because at first I was going to start working with parents around the world and instead started working with therapists because I thought, well, if I work with a family, that's one family. If I work with a therapist, they could have 50 families that they're working with every
Right.
week. So I don't know. It wasn't planned. It just started going. I didn't name myself the Sensory SLP. I just started talking about sensory. People started calling me that. I started doing interviews where they would say, "When did you become the Sensory SLP?" And I was like, I just went with it. I just like changed my social media handle because I was like, okay, enough people are saying this. I'm just going to go with this. And here we are.
And here we are, and here we are in the podcast of someone else, a fellow SLP who's been following you, who you've given good tips not only on here, but just even on your social media. I haven't taken your webinar yet, but you do have a webinar that even a free webinar that you give out
Mhm.
to anybody who wants to take it, which is wonderful, just about sensory strategies. But yeah, I mean, this area is just something that, I mean, is so important, but I feel like has been not explored enough. And I think that that's sad and unfortunate because again, it really is such a foundational piece of everything that anybody does, whether they're neurodivergent or not, but especially if they're already dealing with something that's going to dysregulate them. And so, you and Chris, can I touch upon that for before we go about
Yeah.
you as a dynamic duo? So, you and Chris, maybe I could have him on in the future, Chris.
Yes.
But basically, like mentioned earlier, I knew him before I knew you, even though you guys were together already because you have 5 kids, and so you were already together. But, this piece I'm calling the speech dude, right? And so he would create all these materials, very neuroaffirming for the teens and tweens, while you seem to cover the young children, so it's a perfect marriage, no pun intended even, I know you're not married right now, but you're, basically, essentially, for all intents and purposes, kinda close to it. And so you speak to that a little bit on social media. I've read some of the content on that, on how you guys work together. So how did this kind of business model, like marriage, kind of come blend itself together where you're both so tuned in? Were both of you always just really passionate about this population, about the neuroaffirming worlds, about how to infuse sensory regulation into all of it?
We were both really passionate about autism, and that's really what led us together. We both were on the California board together, and then we realized that we both loved working with autistic kids. Then we decided we were going to start speaking together, and it kind of all like went from there. But there's just so much that we do separately, and then so much that we can do together. And I feel like we're stronger together, and between the two of us we cover pretty much every age range and different work setting, which helps a lot too. So yeah, it's really great being able to work together, but we also have our own separate full-time jobs, but we get to
Right.
work together also.
Right. No, I mean, that's amazing that you're able to bridge it together when you want to, and you could still do your own thing with different age groups. But it is amazing how both of you are so honed in on this specific population and so passionate about it. And it allows you to speak at the ASHA convention together. And people already know you, sensory SLP speech do. Some of them you said don't even know that you're even together. But I actually like just figured it out very recently where because I was following both of you and I realized, wait a second. I know him, I know her. They're with, like, a bunch of kids, so I guess they're together? I mean, it would make sense, right?
Interesting.
Right? I mean, it makes sense in the same house surrounded by children, but before we log off, and again, this has been such a nice conversation with another SLP who also was so passionate about autism and just about how to get through these difficult moments that seem like a crisis in the moment, but really you've given such great tools and strategies from the beginning of the session to the end, to the carryover, to the education piece, to everything like that can really, really support the foundational sensory piece that so many people are really speaking about more. So, thank you for that because any professional listening or any parent listening or neurodivergent individual themselves could really like lean into this and think about, wait, hey, there are some things that can really help me, and maybe I won't feel that way anymore, and maybe I could feel a little bit more calm. Maybe my body can feel like a part of me again. And before we log off, are there any moments from educating, because you've reached a ton of people, right? And so is there a moment in particular, or a couple of moments in particular that you feel like stand out to you in terms of when you've been teaching therapists? They seem to be very accepting because they're signing up for your courses and things like that. Were there any moments that you felt, wow, like that's an aha moment for me too? Or maybe I can learn something from that, or maybe I should study that more or something from all, because you've been educating so many people that are educating so many others.
Yeah, I feel like it's just one aha moment after another, honestly. I think the benefit of being able to talk to so many therapists and Chris and I getting to travel and meet so many teams is that, it's we all have so many unique challenges, but we also have so many challenges that we all face. And that is part of the work that Chris and I do together in our NeuroFirm Academy, is bringing therapists together to be able to solve these bigger issues, because it can feel so lonely. But then you realize, like, wait, that SLP over in that place is also going through exactly the same as I am.
Are there any other places that you would want to promote?
SensorySLP.com, you can find it all.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks again for your time, Jesse,
Thank
and
you so
have a
much.
good afternoon, evening over there in California. Here it's evening. I get all confused. All right. But thank you so much for everything.
Thank
It was a great
you.
conversation. Bye.
Bye.